welcome everybody to the luncheon today and lecture. And California native Adam Arenson is Associate Professor of History and the Chair of the Urban Studies Program at Manhattan College. He's the author of the award-winning The Great Heart of the Republic, St. Louis and the Cultural Civil War, and co-editor of Civil War West, Testing the Limits of the United States, and that's currently at the Autry exhibition right now. He is living in Los Angeles for this year and completing a book on the art, architecture, and context of home savings and loan buildings with the support of Howard Ahmanson Jr. and the Ahmanson Foundation. Arenson has published a half-dozen scholarly articles as well as written for the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, and History News Network. So I'm very pleased to welcome Adam to us. I bet he had no idea what he was getting into when he started.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to Alda and Brian and some other people in the room. I know a lot more about this than when I started, but I'm sure there are people in the room who know things about the Scripps connections and about the Millard Sheets studio that I don't know. And I do welcome whatever you can tell me along the way. The overall project has one of these long but possibly useful titles. Currently, Art at Home Savings, How the Millard Sheets Studio Used Local Histories to Create Architectural Landmarks as Advertising for America's Largest Savings and Loan. We'll see whether they let me keep all of those words, but that's what I'm hoping for right now. I was just writing about my progress. I move in about a month to New York after 5 years of living in LA. I grew up in San Diego. All of those things will come back into the picture. I'm moving to this new job in New York, and I have about 90,000 words written in what I hope to kind of get a first full draft out there. And you're going to see some of the items. As I was saying at our table, I think there are now about 300 of these art and architecture commissions that are part of the project, thinking about corporately sponsored public artworks, either done by the Sheets Studio or done by other artists for home savings. So you're not going to see all 300, which probably we're all thankful for. So yes, if you're waiting for the branch that you really love, it may not make today's slides. The way I have the project organized, and what I hope will be both a museum exhibition and a full-color, medium format, suitable for coffee tables book, roughly 2017, if you want to put it on your list, is around these concepts, and I'm going to I'll work through them as we go. So the first is the story. That when both Millard Sheets and Howard Ahmanson were asked about how this came to be, they always talked about a letter that Howard Ahmanson had sent to Sheets, supposedly out of the blue, saying, have two properties, Wilshire Boulevard, board. I want things that will stand up to the test of time, that 75 years from now will be something people want to see. And then Sheets talks about going to lunch with him, talking about nothing having to do with art and architecture, having the two buildings pointed out to him out the window as they went along, getting back to the office saying, okay, so you'll come back with drawings. And that Sheets came back with drawings, possibly this exact drawing, and they went on, when he brought it into the Ahmanson office, Ahmanson was on the phone, continued on the phone, didn't speak to him, but after about 20 minutes, told the person on the phone, I'm looking at the most amazing drawing I've ever seen. And then when he wanted to talk about budget or about specifics of how the artwork was going to work, he hung up on it. And that's how Sheets always told the story. And that this building, which was at Wilshire and Serrano, Wilshire and Oxford, it's no longer there. It's where the Ahmanson Center is now. The National American Fire Insurance Company building, which was a remodel, was this first building. And he built a nice big office for Howard. He put fire trucks sort of in these little niches and all kinds of other things, a way to park in the back. He brought in trees that were 40 years old, so it wouldn't look like they had just built the thing, that they had been there all along. And he was so pleased that they worked right on to get involved with the next project, which was the first home savings building. So that's one version of the origins of the project. The other is that when I moved here in 2010, that was near when Chase had taken over the buildings from Washington Mutual, most of them. And my parents are in San Diego, so we would come back regularly. In 07, 08, I began to think about, we're talking so much about banks and their assets and saving things. Are we thinking about the bank's cultural assets? So I wrote a quick blog post about that, and I got some attention around it. And then I started looking at other branches. What you're looking at here is, this is a Highland Park mosaic, and this is where they put a shade right through the mosaic. See, it's sort of cemented in over. Here's Millard Sheets' name. That's the top, and then there's the bottom. I think I have another picture of it later where you can really see. But they were just sort of putting that in. There were a few works that were painted over. There were things that were moved around. And so I thought this needed more attention. This is the original vault in Encino, which is now a break room. You can see the refrigerator and the lockers. So alterations, I mean, Home Savings had done some of these alterations. Some of them were done in Washington Mutual, but it wasn't clear that Chase really understood what these buildings were. That they had gotten them basically on a phone call in the middle of the night in Washington saying, Washington Mutual is failing, would you like to have these? And they had no branches on the West Coast, and they said yes. And they didn't really understand what they were getting. So I started blogging about it, what I thought was a side project. As you may have heard, my work is in 19th century Civil War stuff mostly. The first book is about St. Louis. The second book is about the West in general with this Autry exhibition right now. I'm working on another project about African Americans coming back from Canada after the Underground Railroad. So, but I knew that most people tend to write something about where they're from. And this was something about where I was from that mattered to me. When I told friends in roughly 2010 that I was going to start a book about home savings, their reaction was, well, but haven't you been writing that book for a long time? To which I said, what do you mean? They're like, well, this is a friend who went to UCLA. Well, when I was in college, you made me go around and take pictures of the buildings that had the gold tiles and the mosaics on them. So in some way, I had actually been doing this project sort of subconsciously for a while before it became clear to me that I was doing it. Similarly, I went to Yale for grad school, and Sarah Coe, someone who worked in the studio on some of these works, works at Yale in the Visual Resources Library, and she just wrote to me this week saying, well, I think you talked to me about it too. And they're really good at this. So I got to find out kind of my own personal, history of this project a little more. I started just trying to come up with a definitive list of where all these buildings were and who worked on them and when they were done has been a monumental task. I put up what I thought was, a definitive list recently. I've now found a bunch more that are not on the definitive list, so I'm going to be updating it again. But I have both maps and lists on my website. Growing up in San Diego, there are only 2 of them. And so I figured 2 per large city. We're talking maybe 35, 40 locations total. But as I said before, I think they're now like 300. And they're in Ohio, and they're in Missouri, and they're in Florida. And so it's a much wider story, not just about the Millard Sheets years, but about the years that Dennis O'Connor and Sue Hertel continued this work afterwards. And we're going to come to all of that, at least briefly today. So origins, right? According to the version that Millard and Howard would say, it was out of the blue. It was this phone call. Millard just he sketched something, and he came up with this plan. Well, Millard's wife and Howard's wife had been sorority sisters together at UCLA. So they had some connections. They were in some of the same roundtable groups in downtown Los Angeles. They were connected to some of the same people. So it wasn't quite as random as they make it out to be. Similarly, the design has some precedence. Louis Sullivan designed what are called jewel box banks in some of the small communities in the Midwest that have some elements, the kind of 2-story, but very intricate detailing that we see in the projects. Another point of entry that I totally did not know, again, growing up in San Diego, that had this connection, but that Bertram Goodhue, who was the architect for the Balboa Park, California Tower, and the buildings around the fair, worked with a number of artists, architects, and a professor at Scripps, Hartley Alexander, thinking about what kind of iconography should go on buildings at the LA Public Library, the Nebraska State Capitol, and after Goodhue passed away, at Rockefeller Center, which if we want to think of an early, corporate or privately sponsored set of buildings, with lots of art and architecture. You have mosaics there, you have stained glass, you have murals, you have all kinds of things. I point to this building as part of the story, part of how this idea came to Millard Sheets and Howard Ahmanson at this moment. The other thing is that there were murals showing California history in a number of the local banks. These are from the Title Guarantee Building by Hugo Bowen, the same muralist who did the work at the Griffith Park Observatory and the Wilshire Boulevard Temple. He also did some for what was first Security Trust, and then became Security First, and then became Security Pacific. They were the local bank that really had the longest history of this work, going back in the 1920s and 30s. Another artist doing this work at that time, his name is Einar Peterson, and he created some works for hotels, and then this was one that was in the Beverly Hills Security First branch. It's now, I think, some sort of high-end clothing store. Right about that time, Millard Sheets also creates this image. It's published by the Auto Club, but it's an image of the founding of LA. You can see painting by Millard Sheets, and it was linked to a number of poems. And it was produced as a booklet by the Auto Club in 1936. So there are ways in which he's in this world with the various people creating murals and doing this work in downtown Los Angeles, even before, we're talking, still 2 decades before the studio and the moment with Howard Ahmanson. Similarly, he had done mural work at the San Francisco World's Fair, some of which is more political or more tied to things beyond kind of local history. Diego Rivera is also working in San Francisco at that period, and so he's interacting with other sort of mural traditions. When thinking about commissions that pull together art into a project that's essentially about architecture, there's a good discussion in the transcript of there are these oral histories that Sheets did, one with the Smithsonian and one with UCLA. He talks about how basically he knew a business person who was involved with the government's effort to build airfields that would reach the Pacific Ocean. This is before Pearl Harbor, but right in the run-up to what will become World War II on all sides of the globe. And there's an effort to build these airfields, and there are these contracts to do so. And Sheets said, well, I don't know anything about building airfields, but I'm interested, which was very much Sheets' personality. It seems that he was interested in being an impresario, helping to run a project, finding the people who could do some of the technical knowledge as needed. And he said that whether it was a ship, he was on a ship during World War II to Southeast Asia, he painted a mural in the galley of the ship because he wanted to beautify the space. Here you can see there's 2 Native Americans on horseback in one of these airfield dining rooms. He wasn't happy with the furniture options, so he was working on designing chairs and having cadets stand on the chairs to see if the chairs would break as a way to measure whether they were going to work or not. And then right at that moment, this conversation with Ahmanson happens in late 1953, after he had done work for the Pacific Clay Products Building at 4th and Bixel. He's also doing work for American Trust, which is a bank with branches in San Francisco and Sacramento that was celebrating its centennial. And if you look at this image, there are 2 of them. There's one called the Panorama of Yesterday and then one called the Panorama of Today, sort of the same geography but 2 different sets of figures. You can see a lot of the themes, the colors, some of the work that comes out in a lot of the home savings work is already in Millard Sheets' thinking, and it's being used in this context with American Trust. So, though we may have some romance around the story version, I think there are all these ways in which there are all these different influences built into how Millard Sheets thought about the art and architecture of these buildings. So I had this in here before I knew Paul was going to be here. But when we think about the process, Paul's first documentary and the second one in process really helps us think about the Scripps connections very deeply, about how Millard at this point had been a student at Chouinard. He becomes a professor in his time, teaching at Chouinard while he's there, and then Scripps says, well, we want to build an art program, come out here and start hiring people, essentially. And then once that gets put together with the GI Bill and the connections after the war, there's a very large, impressive number of students, and the building we were in, I think someone was telling me, is fundraised out of the Fine Arts Foundation in that period, and Scripps becomes a kind of node of all of this art and architecture and design work because of the people that Millard is able to bring together here. He then is asked to do the same thing at Otis, and has a sort of second round of doing it at Otis before he gets out of the art school administration work permanently. So thinking about who are those people who are on the ground at the beginning, again, the film talks about others, but the ones I want to emphasize are Gene and Arthur Ames. You can see here you have Gene, Arthur, that's Howard Ahmanson, that's Millard Sheets. These two men are Pomona officials, because that's the opening of the Pomona Mall. They went one artwork to another, sort of down the mall, opening one at a time. So Gene and Arthur Ames, and also Albert Stewart, and then you had to see John Svensson, his student there at the time, but who's relevant to this work as well, were some of the first people that Sheets had hired. There were others at that period too, but Stewart's sculpture work and the Ameses, both in terms of their mosaic talents, they were essentially the local people who understood mosaics, as well as Gene's work teaching design classes, were a really important influence on the people who go into the Sheets studio, many of whom were students in this period. So at that first branch, Sheets does not think small. If you've been to 9245 Wilshire, the first Beverly Hills branch. This is the design for the stained glass window that is done with all these colors, and this is the sketches for that. And talking to Rufus Turner about the way, that's Pomona First Federal, but talking about the way this stuff worked, that Sheets might provide you that much of a draft of what a building should look like, and then your job was to do all the planning and blueprints and works that would actually make it so you could create a building from that design, right? So this is in some ways detailed for the kinds of sketches and doodles that I've seen in the archives. This is maybe more typical. And the process chapter, which at the moment is a monster, focuses on all of the people involved with going from Sheets' idea to a finished product. These are full-size cartoons for stained glass windows that Stu Hertel, one of those students of the Ameses and others in that period, was in charge of creating the cartoons, whether they were going to be mosaics or whether they were going to be stained glass windows. And there are a lot of partners involved. I mean, in a minute you're going to see a whole list of names of what I think of as the Sheets studio, but here you're looking at Millard, Sue Hertel, and the Wallaces, the John Wallace and Helen Wallace, who were the people who ran the stained glass fabricating studio that still exists and is run by their daughter. That's the bottom of that first mosaic when we saw the sketch for, stained glass in the Beverly Hills branch. This is David Underwood. This is Martha Menke Underwood. In that period, before 1960, David Underwood had actually hired Millard to decorate Bob's Big Boy in Phoenix that he was working on. And then as the work and architecture got bigger, Millard hired Dave Underwood to work for him, making that architectural work come together. Once they were in Dallas, then Millard met Rufus Turner and convinced Rufus Turner to come from his first job in Dallas and join among the architects. The sculpture work was always done outside of the studio. So Albert Stewart, John Svensson here, Betty Davenport Ford, the sculptures were never, there maybe was a sketch, or Millard said, I would like a dolphin, right? But you were then to figure out how that dolphin was going to come together and how that work was going to be done. And this is all the period before there is a studio. These are pictures of the studio under construction. The studio is finished 59, essentially. There are two buildings that are finished. One's finished a little earlier, one's finished a little later. But a lot of the early iconic home savings buildings are being done even before the studio exists. And I talked in the chapter about there was a real learning curve, especially around mosaics, about figuring out how to get the mosaics the way that he wanted them. The first building, the National American Fire Insurance Building, the mosaic for that building is done by the Ravenna Mosaic Company of St. Louis, which is someone that Sheets had worked with before. The first one on the building in Beverly Hills, Sheets does himself with two Otis grad students. Ronald Gerber, and James Edgar Michalski. And if you know anything about either one of them, I would love to know, because that's all I know. But Sheets talked about, in some ways, he was unhappy with it, and if you look at the sketch and you look at the mosaic, they're quite different. And so there's this period where, as I've been reconstructing it, there was a real effort to find people who could understand the mosaic work, as the Ameses did. So many of them were Ameses students, Andre Mahoney at this table, among others, working on, and Martha Menke Underwood's really helping the studio figure out how to do these mosaics. And there are a lot of starbursts and suns and little birds in this period, which I'm beginning to think were training exercises in some way. That learning how to do these birds correctly would allow them to go on to do much larger things. They're creating, this is Sue on a ladder, working on the cartoon for Arcadia. That cartoon is in full color because this is one of the ones that was sent to St. Louis and done elsewhere. There are a few of the early ones that are done that way. And the story of the Mosaic Studio really changes with the arrival of Dennis O'Connor. This is Dennis working on putting the pieces together for the Detroit Public Library mosaics, which are really incredibly amazing. The Masonic Temple, which is this 4-story mosaic on the outside and a number on the inside, and the Detroit Public Library are right in that period, which is, Dennis starts working roughly 61 in the studio. And that's when the style changes, and that Dennis's kind of approach to the mosaics begins to take over. That Martha and Sue had kind of tried to, had done the training of what Millard wanted, and they were creating things that they liked. But Dennis is really able to create the opportunity to expand beyond that, starting in that period. One of the ways you could create, iconic architecture is just by repeating the same architecture somewhere else, right? And so you're looking at Beverly Hills on the top and Studio City on the bottom, right? That's the same building. Similarly, the sculptures that are out front, the Renzo Fenci sculptures, they ordered a bunch of them and they put them in different places. So in many of those cases, they are integrating all of these things together, right? That was key to how Sheets thought about this from the beginning. There's gilded tile, there's mosaic, there's stained glass, there's sculpture, there are painted murals in a lot of them. I think some of the early ones are able to pull this together, and then places like Rancho Palos Verdes, I think we can really see where, when they got beyond the basics of figuring this out, some of the ranches like Compton and Buena Park are really efforts to figure out how they can do this on their own, how to do mosaics in the studio. Then you're getting out to branches that I think are really very beautifully sited, very iconic, and we're able to have the full effort of the studio behind them. So, when I say the studio, what do I mean? Prepare for 3 slides of names. So, first, Millard and Sue were really the center. When Millard was in charge, Millard and Sue were sort of the center of the studio as I see it. And then there were various wings. I mean, there was literally an architecture wing. So these are names of architects, starting with David Underwood and Rufus Turner, and then some of those who were later hired. There's eventually an effort, because Millard Sheets is being recognized as the architect on these buildings, though he's not ever licensed as an architect. As they begin to build larger buildings, especially Frank Homolka, who is down in Long Beach, becomes the kind of architect of record for buildings. And also that's around when Sheets is moved to Gualala also. We're talking about late 60s, early 70s. Sheets buys a property in Gualala. He eventually builds a house. He eventually moves there and closes the studio. But that's like a process between like the mid-50s and 1980. So Sheets' efforts to be involved or not be involved change over time in that way. Similarly, as I said, there's the contract work, the work that's always being done outside the studio. The stained glass, the sculptures, and the tapestries, including the one the screen is now in front of, right, that has Sue Hertel's signature and the PF of Pinson Freres right down in the corner. There was a set of administrative support people, some of whom, like Mary Dane, had worked for Scripps and then were brought into the studio. Luann Spencer, I think, also had worked for Scripps before coming to work full-time for the studio. And then there's the question of the mosaics. The mosaics was the hardest work. Tony Sheets talked to me about how he was in there for a week and he thought it was the longest week of his life. Clearly it took a certain temperament for people to be able to do that. And this is a set of names from the first era, sort of before Dennis O'Connor arrived, of mostly, again, students of Gene and Arthur Ames doing those. You'll see we have some question marks. If you can fill in first names or last names where I don't have them, I'd be happy to have them. And then, again, once Dennis was there, sort of working very much under sort of Millard and then Sue and then Dennis on these mosaics, and the various people under. You have other names, including people in the room like Brian and Alba. And then there's a period where Sheets, for various reasons, is trying to step away. I mean, he says for about 2 decades that he really wants to paint full time, but he continues to work on these projects all through that period. Similarly, he says, I don't want to work for Home Savings exclusively, I want to do something else, which the Home Savings people think means paint full time. But instead, he goes and signs a contract with Interpace, where it becomes this sort of chief design officer and brings in people like Harrison McIntosh, Rupert Dietz, and others to do ceramic work, some of which then goes into these corporate projects, things like the Hilton in Honolulu. But never, you see Interpace tile like bathroom tile in the Home Savings, but not being used in art settings in the Home Savings buildings, though later there are ceramic tile mosaics. The installers, they work with 2 guys that they really trust all along. And then, as I mentioned, there's a period after Sheets finally does move to Koala, says, I'm not going to do the initial designs on these anymore, and Dennis O'Connor and Sue Hertel become the key liaison to Home Savings, and the artwork begins to change. We'll stop with all the names and we'll go back to artwork in a minute, I promise. But I've also been trying to track down people who worked on these projects we're talking 1980s now, some of which were being contracted locally, some of which were being sent to Milan and were being done there. And even after the period where they're working with Dennis, there's a period where Home Savings is working with other artists, but they like Joyce Kozloff and Roger Brown. And they like the mosaic look so much that they're telling people who don't generally work in mosaic to create mosaics designs, and then the designs are sent to another Italian fabricator in Spilimbergo, and they're being installed. There's one on a tower in Chicago. There's some at the Irwindale headquarters building. So the way Sheets originally designed that first building, right, which again he claims came to him as he thought about how Howard Ahmanson wasn't going to tell him anything, that becomes the template which Home Savings is responding to as long as they do art and architecture, which is from 56 is when the Beverly Hills building is done, all the way through 91. So it's a very long period and about 300 works all over the place. So what went into thinking about where a branch should be and what should be on it? The first thing to note is that when Home Savings was sort of first working with Sheets, they had a whole hodgepodge of branches. This is from one of their ads in that period in 1953. They had branches in some of the locations they later changed. Studio City, they tear down this perfectly respectable Art Moderne kind of streamlined building to build what they eventually built there. This is what Highland Park looked like at that moment, though you'll see that it had even a previous life. They were in a different downtown skyscraper. In Arcadia, they were in what sort of looks like a house, really, more than any sort of storefront. Howard Ahmanson is very insistent that they go to corners, that they try to find the most prominent corner. When I first tried to figure out where these things were before I got a Home Savings directory, I would just go in a community that seemed far enough away from the last one, and I'd get off the freeway, and I'd go on the main street about 2 blocks. And if there wasn't a Home Savings right there, then there wasn't going to be one in that community. I could kind of sense them. I mean, that's how this is Burbank. That's how I found the Burbank one first, without really having the address of it. So these were, as you can see, they're next to car dealerships. They were next to all kinds of things. Howard Ahmanson and Home Savings sort of understood that as these communities developed, these were going to be the center of town. The places around them were going to change. So they wanted to build the first big landmark building in those locations. The Pomona Mall, they didn't build a lot of towers in the early years. The Pomona Mall in some ways was Sheets' pet project. Pomona was his hometown. He wanted to think about, with the local leaders, about how to make Pomona a landmark, and so the U.S. Conference of Mayors actually comes to see this pedestrian mall, this revitalization of downtown. And though there had been projects like this in Miami and at the 3rd Street Promenade before, Sheets wanted to see, what if I did the kind of work I do with Home Savings, where I think about every detail, think about it for the mall. And you can see that's part of what happened here. In terms of, Sheets is also, again, in this period doing all kinds of things. This is a Albert Stewart Millard Sheets proposed monument to democracy that was commissioned by John Anson Ford. That's who's in the picture. This is 1954. It was built, the idea was it was going to be the size of the Statue of Liberty, and it was going to be in the San Pedro Harbor. And it was going to be sort of the Pacific Cold War answer to the Statue of Liberty, right? That it was going to be a place where there was going to be a museum in these bottom pedestal branches focused on human rights and democracy and all of these questions, and that was going to be a grand project. Spoiler alert, it wasn't built. Ahmanson in this period is actually quite involved with Republican Party politics as well. Despite the smile in this picture, Nixon was not his candidate. He was involved with what we might think of as establishment Republicans, people like Goodwin Knight, who are much closer to, if you want to think nationally about Nelson Rockefeller, than to people like Nixon and Goldwater and Reagan. As Nixon sort of builds a takeover of the California Republican Party in this period, Ahmanson also has a first heart attack, and these two events together kind of push him out of an interest in politics and into a greater interest in cultural work in the city. This is when he gets involved with the Music Center. This is when he gets involved with building the original buildings of the LACMA, which he commissioned from William Pereira, and that's sort of what he wanted. And Norton Simon gets angry about that. Norton Simon goes to Pasadena. So you may know those stories. But this is a period where the politics of the location are very important to home savings, but the kind of national politics are not, unless they're going to affect savings and loan regulations. That's what they were mostly concerned about. An example of this is the Compton Branch. That's the Compton Branch when it was finished in '58. You can see they're very small mosaics on the outside. This is the period where I feel, my argument is that they didn't really have a great sense of how they were going to do mosaics, so they have small ones on the outside and on the inside. It does have one of those versions of the sculpture that are in Arcadia and the other branches being done at this time. And Compton is a bedroom community, majority white, in the late 50s, and it doesn't have the history that when we think of Compton now, it didn't have that history yet. This is the Watts Riots, which obviously changes, or is part of the change of that community, but it also, what Home Savings does first is actually see this as a period with the various commissions to go and expand their presence in these communities. They buy what had been Royal Savings and Loan, which was in El Sereno, and also in Laguna, and they put this sculpture of African Americans in a branch that they build in the South Central area. There were various kinds of incentives from the state and federal government to do these things, but Home Savings saw the way to deal with changing demographics and to think about questions of not just, when the goal obviously was to find the people with the most money who could put them in the bank and invest. They didn't want the very rich people because they could afford stockbrokers and to think about the stock market. But in this period, they figured everyone else was just going to put their money in the equivalent of a CD at the savings and loan, where interest rates were higher than in other kinds of banks. A lot of their customers, people who had survived the Depression and might have had the money at home, and they wanted to be a place that was secure. They built these sort of fortress-looking buildings. There were vault doors in a lot of these early buildings, so there weren't really vaults in the traditional sense. They were just vault doors, okay, to get across that psychology of security. Home Savings talked about peace of mind since 1885, though Howard Ahmanson had only owned this bank since 1947. So the shield, which was designed by Sheets, is another sort of symbol of that security, right? So that was the strategy. That was the banking strategy, was to find people who wanted to have a safe place to put their money. And though my location chapter thinks about, this is what the Compton Branch looked like last time I was there. It's now a stereo shop, but you can see, the mosaic is not in spectacular shape, but they are there. The interior vault doors are still there, which is not true of some like Buena Park, which is totally gutted on the inside. You can see the sculptures are still there. So, there are gold tiles, for example, on the Ahmanson Trust Bank in Beverly Hills that were painted over gray by one of the later owners, but here they're still gold. So I see, rather than think about, this is a story about how Compton changed, and Compton obviously struggled as it became less white and more majority minority, and all kinds of reasons that tax and disinvestment happened. I think a building like this that's still there gives us an opportunity to kind of connect the story of this work, right, being done in Claremont, to a place like Compton where it doesn't seem like there's an obvious connection. But in '58, if you would ask somebody, oh, I'm thinking of leaving Claremont and moving down to Compton, they thought, oh, great idea, right? Because they were communities with certain kinds of ties in common in that period. And I think we can think about that again. Okay, we have a little more on the doom and gloom for this part of it, is that's the South Central branch after the '92 riots. Right, and I was just saying to somebody that I was recently at, there's a Ferguson, Missouri branch actually too, that has not been damaged, but that is about 2 blocks from where Michael Brown was shot. So it's interesting to think about, because Ferguson has a similar history, I don't know if you've been following, to Compton, right, that it's a community that was built as a suburb for a certain period where they assumed it would be mostly white residents, and that changed over time. Home savings went in the South Central neighborhoods and rebuilt this building. It rebuilt a traditionally African-American savings and loan nearby too. It did have a pretty good relationship with these communities, but obviously it wasn't such a relationship that they weren't damaged in the '92 riots, right? So the location chapter tried to think about these questions about politics and about being a place that's sort of displaying a certain kind of wealth and security in communities that feel less wealthy and less secure over time. Highland Park is another interesting story, again, sort of ongoing. This is what the Highland Park building looked like when Home Savings owned it, before Ahmanson owned it. It had been there since the 1890s. The same building is essentially there that Home Savings renovated, first in the 50s to kind of make it look like the others, and then these mosaics go in later. I think they're in the 60s. I'd have to check the date. There's that awning that's cut through the bottom of the mosaic. And Highland Park is currently changing again, in terms of its Latino population, in terms of its hipster population. And so this is near, sort of on a wall around the corner, you're seeing a different version of public art, right? And thinking about expressing values through art in that same neighborhood. Again, I'm not seeing this as a bad contrast, but I think it's an interesting way in which the Home Savings artworks become part of the landmark, the environment, right? They're sort of part of the atmosphere. And some of the people who went on to have very strong kind of studio art, museum-focused careers, who did work for Home Savings, talking about how much they hated Millard Sheets' work. But I've heard that from a few of them about how they thought it was boring or so conventional. But then some of them said it's actually kind of grown on them over time. The concept of someone who has a studio in Santa Monica, and he says going by that building, a building that Sheets himself, he said sometimes he didn't like the mosaic, but that those connections are something that just becomes part of the landscape. And I think for so many Southern Californians, this is something they've always known. They always sort of are aware of it, but they don't know the story. And that's part of what I've enjoyed telling in this project. So, the next chapter thinks about meaning. Okay, and if you're keeping track, there's just meaning and legacy, so we're almost towards the end. Meaning, what were the values that Home Savings wanted to express, right? How were these going to work together? The first is almost all the early works focus on family. Again, here you have what used to be in front of the Pasadena branch is now inside. That little Chase woman was not there originally, in case you needed me to tell you that. But a lot of the early sculptures focus on family groups and focus on leisure time, right? That this is Arcadia. That they weren't place specific. They weren't about the local history. They were images that kind of got across that idea of, if you invest here, you'll have time to have this leisure time. You'll have time to spend with your family. Things will be secure. The first symbol created for the Ahmanson company was this winged lion, right? Again, harkening back to maybe Venice, lots of, maybe Persia or Egypt. It's an old symbol, but not anything specific to the location. Over time, that changed. Very much this became about putting something on the bank locally that said something to the community, saying, we've always been here, we're part of your community, as well as connecting to the other Home Savings works. This is a much later document, but it's something that Dennis created to help them figure out, as he sent this memo, basically, you're opening a branch in Missouri, this is what I want to look for, right? What can you show me about who lived there? What kind of animals are local? What's in the landscape? Who's a prominent family? This is how they went about researching. The first work that Sheets did in this way is in what's now the Amoca museum, the Pomona First Federal in Pomona, again, not home savings, is this very long history of the Pomona Valley in a mural. And I think this is one of my favorites. I was thinking today that in some ways the Studio City branch is most likely to be on the cover if I get any say, which most of the time I don't, but you can hope. Is because I feel it's a nice snapshot. It's sort of like California history in four vignettes. You have the friar, the Franciscan friar, and the Native Americans. You have the Vaquero, the California era. You have the Gold Rush era, and then you have this 20th century, television camera era. And maybe that's a television camera taking in all of them. Maybe this is 4 different dramas on different channels, when there only were 4 channels. So 2 before that. Okay. I think that in some ways that this one and like the Rancho Palos Verdes, some of those are really the kind of high moment of how these things work together. There were very much an effort to show Native Americans that they were often shown in what we as historians think of as a troubling way, and that this is what used to be here, and now we can push them off the stage and ignore them and move forward, but at least they're there. I mean, when we think about who were the communities living in California in this period, right, in the 1950s and 60s, it's the same mix of ethnicities that we have now, maybe in different numbers. But to be emphasizing Native American history in these branches is an unusual element. There's a lot of this kind of California, mission past that gets into it. This is my branch growing up in La Mesa, California, just outside of San Diego, which is where I was. And family groups also gave a few opportunities to introduce new subjects. This is the West Portal branch in San Francisco, and this is a kind of Pacific Rim image that shows families from all across the Pacific. Somewhere on here, I think, I can't see it right now, but at least on the sketch, and I think on the finished one there are names that say like Australia, Chile, Mexico, Polynesia, whatever, focused on the different, they're down here, aha, that's why I didn't see them up there. Okay, so Japan, right, and you have people obviously working in elements linked to food, right, in each one it's agriculture or it's fishing, and again, it's these family groups as a way to introduce a new concept in this larger mosaic. So, but if you look for African Americans, they're very few and far between. There are basically 3, and this is one in Florida, in Port Charlotte, Florida, that's done much later. And again, so when I think about the question about these changing relationships to certain communities, that's sort of a piece that stands out about how few African American figures there are in these, and that this work for South Central was done by a sculptor named Vertus Hayes, who worked in Harlem, and so it was again all the sculptures were done outside of the studio, but it wasn't one of the local sculptors doing that work. Oh, I lied, there's Reception and then Legacies, but Reception is fun, so. So there are these crazy moments, right? This is Governor Goodwin Knight, Howard Ahmanson, Millard Sheets, and a few others cutting a cake. It's a full-size cake in the shape of the first branch. I gotta get a better version, but that's the version that ran in the LA Times, right? So these were big events. And Ahmanson, he had made money by restructuring the way savings and loans had worked. They'd all been mutual organizations where kind of the profits went back into the group. He was able to split that and create a business on top of the mutual organization. That's how he made his money, and along with a lot of the savings and loans that changed in that period. But he also really wanted the experience at Home Savings to be a good one. He'd go to other banks and watch who was the fastest teller, and then he would hire them on their lunch break. He would make sure that people would go out and greet people. They had a set of people called redcoats. I recently met the woman who was the first redcoat, and they wore these red outfits. They looked like flight attendants, sort of, and they were on hand for openings. They would go to people's offices and sort of explain to your doctor's office or whatever why this was the right place to bank. When she discovered that the closest bank to Leisure World was in Santa Ana, she used to go to Leisure World. She ended up with a column in the newspaper in Leisure World, and then she ended up with a television show on the Leisure World television network. This is in the late 60s, early 70s, and she was ferrying the money to the Santa Ana branch before the Laguna Hills branch opened. For the opening of the Sunset Vine Hollywood branch, Charlton Heston was the MC. They buried it. There had been a time capsule there because it had been the NBC radio studios. and they buried a new one that had something from Orson Welles and something from lots of big Hollywood stars. They wanted this to be a landmark for the community, not just about them, which conveniently, if you're the bank and you can get everyone to cover it like a news event, means you're getting all that free advertising. There were these brochures emphasizing both the history and the artwork and the kind of customer service they would offer. And the reception chapter also talks about the communities they didn't think having a 2-story travertine box was going to be right for them. Especially in the Bay Area, they suddenly ran into groups that had zoning laws. And they were receptive in changing that Santa Cruz on the left. There was a whole argument where they weren't going to be allowed to build anything in Walnut Creek, and they said, well, wait a minute, those guys are going to build this, what we would now call ugly, brutalist sculpture, office building, the San Francisco Federal Savings Bank. Why can't we build? And so this is a Frank Homolka design. It's a larger branch that was used as a regional center in Walnut Creek that they were allowed to build. And then it also talks about the moment where they were able to reintroduce themselves to these communities around the country. The home part of home savings had been trademarked in Texas, so they weren't allowed to use it, so they became Savings of America. And they created branches like this one is in Illinois, I think, and that's a picture of a newspaper article about the one in Florida, where they were welcomed just as they'd been welcomed early on, with news articles, with events. I mean, there's a memo in the Millard Sheets papers where it says, we're going to stop covering these like they're news events. That after Sunset Vine, it stopped being something where it was like, well, you guys are just another branch building opening. You want to be part of the community, but you're still a business. When they went to these other communities, they were able to have that experience again, of being welcomed as bringing this public art and architecture to the community. So, legacies. So when Sheets finally, he sells the building up here, the studio building. Eventually, Dennis and Sue are working and they're renting it back. Eventually they move out of there into Upland. They continue doing work for home savings, though it does change. You can see this is an image, I think, with, again, a slightly more diverse cast in Temple City that's starting that period. And here you have the space shuttle in the one in Lancaster, right? Which would be unthinkable, I think, in the Sheets era. That really, history was important, but it also ended in the 1890s. So to bring it up to the present is a kind of a reaction in that period. This one is also fabricated in Italy, and so there are changes in some of the mosaic technique in some of those as well. Home Savings tears down the downtown branch to build the Home Savings Tower. They tear down the Pasadena branch to build the Pasadena Towers. Though they do bring in, this is work by Richard Hawes, inside to kind of bring in elements of some of those same themes, but now being done by different artists. Hawes also creates a mosaic for the one branch in Queens in New York. When they take over Bowery Savings, they build one with a mosaic in New York. And I think of this as a good transition to think about these final ones, is that this is in Monterey Park. It was designed by Astrid Preston, and the tile work, the ceramic tile work, is by Marlo Bartels, but that sun up there is still mosaic. And Astrid talks about how she went out to Dennis's studio, and Dennis helped show her how to do just that much mosaic, all in gold, you can see. But it kind of connects this much later work that's focused on kind of, a streetscape. It has an element of some Asian elements with the bamboo, right? It's talking about changing communities. This is the period when Monterey Park is becoming increasingly Asian American as well, or Asian migrant groups. And it's where the themes, right? The travertine, or something that looks like travertine. It's not travertine now. It's a kind of beige tile. Is being brought into these late works, still reflecting some of the early ideas. I think there are legacies outside of home savings too. This is a work that the Huntington is now installed near the Millard Sheets mural that they recently installed. It was done for the Mutual Savings and Loan of Pasadena in 1964. So you can see, I think other banks began to notice that it was time to put some real high quality art, not just some print in a frame, on the walls when Home Savings was doing this. Bank of America creates a total mosaic branch in San Mateo, where the founder of Bank of America lived. Both Gilmore Bank and Bank of California are new banks that I think kind of play on 1950s art and architecture in an effort to kind of be in the community in the same way, an effort to have that relationship. That's my sense of it so far. I do want to talk to executives from their banks if they think about home savings and how they go about things. And travertine, if you start looking around LA, you start to see a lot of travertine and a lot of marble, right? That's the Getty and the LACMA. This is the Broad building at the LACMA, right? That this shot is actually from, there were branches that were built as temporary branches. This one is the corner of Pico and Doheny as overflow from the Beverly Hills branch. It's near where I live now. All it ever got was travertine and the gold cladding being tiles. But it still said home savings to people, right? People kind of understood it was linked to that bigger, fancier branch nearby. And it's interesting to think about. Obviously, the first LACMA buildings, which are on a slide coming up, also have a real strong home savings feel to them, because they were Pereira buildings sponsored by Ahmanson, but there's no obvious reason that these other later museums carry that on. So that's on my question mark. I'm writing this part of the chapter right now, so if you have ideas, you can get credit. But a big part of why I think I diverted from 19th century work to do this was the 07-08 Chase takeover, right? That it really, I think Chase is beginning to figure out what they have, but they didn't really know at the time. This is the work of an artist named Alex Schaefer, who wants to kind of emphasize ways in which, you know, banks and our relationship around the 07-08 meltdown are on fire, even if the buildings aren't literally on fire. And obviously it has a relationship to the Ed Richet LACMA on fire, right? Which again is an Ahmanson building with that Pereira and again those shapes. And of course this is also currently threatened with being demolished as they're talking about building a new LACMA building. There are little ways in which this work has disappeared. There's a whole discussion in San Francisco about these trees, that the city wanted certain trees, and Sheets knew at the time that the trees were going to grow and cover up the mosaics, and sure enough, there they are, right? Those are the mosaics, this is what you can see. There's a friend of Tony Sheets who's working hard to just get the city to cut the trees, right? So you can see the mosaics, so they're having to stand right up under them. This is a painting also in San Francisco branch that was painted over. That's just totally gone. There's another one in Redwood City that's totally gone. And then there's this. That's a painted over mosaic in Long Beach. So, and that should be clean. You know, the small t are glass. So yeah, you can see the Dennis O'Connor C, D, and then an O for Dennis O'Connor. That you should be able to, and I don't know a ton about removing paint, but you know the way that they are, you should be able to just remove the paint and see that mosaic again. There are a few that were just destroyed. I mean, the buildings were destroyed and the mosaics went with them. Pasadena, one of the ones in Santa Monica that was on 3rd Street, are an example of that. And there's a way in which, again, this stuff that's Santa Barbara, that there are lots of shields that were home saving shields in various ways, and some were removed and some were just painted over, right? So I think that this history is obviously within the lived memory of people who grew up, I'd say, you know, can remember a time before 1995, I would say, if I were to pick a date. Which, you know, the good news is there are a lot of those people. But the other thing is there are a lot of people who can't remember before 1995. You know, that my freshmen will have been born in the year 97, 98, you know, 2000, coming this fall. And so this is leaving the realm of lived memory. And I think unless you really were a home savings junkie or worked for home savings, knowing where all of them are, really no one seems to know where all of them are. I mean, I thought there were like 36, and I'm up to around 250 of just home savings. And this week I found out about 4 more, because there were artists who worked for home savings. We have records from Millard Sheets, we have records from Dennis O'Connor. We don't really have records from the other artists after that. Many of them still have the records in their houses, right? That they're still active, though thinking about retirement. And so those haven't been cataloged. And so, you know, I knew, for example, Peter Ledoki did one in Tustin, but he told me he also did one in Salinas and one in Dallas that I had never seen. But if you put in home savings mosaic Salinas, it comes right up. So I think there are these pockets of memory. And then when you go to places like Missouri, people really have no idea that it's part of this wider world. There were 4 in Missouri, and there are more like 12 in both Florida and Illinois. So I'm trying to connect all these people, to build a master list, and then to tell the story in a way that gets these ideas across, something that started in many ways right here at Scripps and reaches way out all through the country. Thank you. the various pros in the room were consulting on various things, hopefully not telling me what I'm going to do wrong. But if I did it wrong, tell me about it later, please.
The reason that they use the terrazzo and the gold around the top was originally, I think they put that on a temporary building in Santa Monica to make it look solid, because they thought nobody would bring their money to a temporary looking building. And so it was fake solid.
Right. Well, and the very first Beverly Hills branch has it. So Sarah Smyser up here, whose husband worked for Home Savings in the construction division. Is that the right word? I don't know what to say.
He was the company architect.
He was the first architect hired by Home Savings. Was talking about how the temporary branches got, when I said that, for example, that Pico and Doheny branch was temporary. It was temporary in one way, but when they knew they were going to build a branch there, they put trailers up, and they still put gold tiles. They even had a few mosaics, some of the ones that are in Urbandale now, in frames. They were sort of hung outside the building. And sometimes if the renderings were done, they would have the renderings available, and they would hand them out saying, this is what your branch here in Rialto will look like when it's done. And so there was an effort to make that instant visual connection between Home Savings and this architecture, even if it was just a temporary branch. Yes?
Time-wise, how long did Sheets work that way? I mean, from what date to what date?
So the first one is finished in 56. The first conversation is in 53. So the first one takes a while, the National American Fire Insurance Building. It's finished in 55. Ahmanson says, this is great, let's start the other one now. And he gives them a few months to finish. So they're really scrambling on that Beverly Hills branch. A lot of when branches are being done after that have to do with regulations. They weren't allowed to build new branches for savings and loans for a certain period. They're not allowed to build, for example, they don't go to San Francisco and San Diego until 76, I think, because the laws were you could only be in a certain number of counties. So they're essentially all in Los Angeles and Orange County, and then they're later in other places. You could grow by merging. So a lot of like Pasadena and Studio City, they bought local savings and loans, and then eventually could build on those places. Again, Sheets says, I'm quitting, and then he says it again, and he says it again. 74 is when I think that's when he leaves his Padre Hills house and moves sort of all the stuff to Gualala, though he starts renting an apartment in Pasadena. 80 is when the studio is closed, and there's a note on one of the branches in 79 or 80 where Sheets says, this is my last design. So 79 or 80. But then you have a ton being done after that by Dennis and Sue, sometimes using very similar ideas, and then by others as well. So Sheets has, for example, Sheets designed buildings in Texas, but they were all they were for savings and loans in Lubbock and Dallas that pre-existed the Home Savings work. I think all the Sheets designed artwork for Home Savings is in California. I'd have to really think about it, but I mean, obviously there are other projects, but for Home Savings, I think they're all in California. Yes?
The building in Palos Verdes, where they've just finished rehabbing that, haven't they?
Right.
Is that a Chase Bank?
Yes.
Okay, do they have plans to do any more?
I don't. So Louis Carnevale, I know, was very involved. Carnevale and Laura were the granite suppliers to Home Savings. I know he was involved with the renovation work there and sort of protecting the mosaic from water damage and other things. I don't have a great sense of how that happened. I should probably learn more about who was the impetus. I don't think it came from Chase. It may have come from the local branch in some ways, but it didn't come top down from Chase. So that does not suggest that it'll necessarily continue. But they're more aware of this now, and for example, the wood panel mosaic that was in Pasadena that was taken out is now at Pasadena Community College. That Tony helped make that happen. So there are a few other instances of that. Okay. Okay, well, thanks everyone.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Adam. That's a very informative presentation. And we will look forward to the book's publication in another 2 years. we'll try to have it available for Fine Arts members to purchase when it does come out. So, thank you all.